Just before midnight, on March 9, 1945, as Tokyo's waterfront glowed faintly beneath a moonless sky, a single Japanese fighter clawed upward through the cold darkness, its pilot unaware that in the next 12 minutes he would uncover the secret that explained why Japan was losing the air war, why entire squadrons were vanishing in minutes, and why the Americans' most feared bomber seemed to anticipate every attack before it even began. Lieutenant Nakamura Hiroshi was no novice. He had survived 42 combat sorties against the American B-29 Superfortress, an aircraft the Japanese had come to regard not merely as a bomber, but as a technological phantom, one that climbed too high, flew too fast, and defended itself with impossible accuracy. Yet tonight, as ground control shouted coordinates into his headset, and as radar screens across Honshu lit up with the unmistakable signature of the largest incendiary raid of the war, Hiroshi saw something he had never seen before. The Americans were flying low, dangerously low, at an altitude where Japanese fighters could finally meet them on equal terms. What he didn't know, what no Japanese pilot knew, was that he was minutes away from encountering the most advanced defensive weapons system of the entire conflict, one that did not merely fire at attackers, but calculated their movements, anticipated their evasions, and directed multiple turrets with machine precision. By the time Hiroshi realized what he was up against, the sky over Tokyo Bay would already be glowing red. At 11:47 p.m., Hiroshi pushed his Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate into maximum climb, the aircraft shuddering as its overworked engine strained for altitude in the humid night air rising off Tokyo Bay, and he listened as ground controllers relayed the numbers. No pilot wanted to hear 300 American bombers, altitude 7,000 feet, speed 230 miles per hour, time to intercept 15 minutes, figures that signaled not merely another raid, but a strategic shift, because B-29s did not operate at 7,000 feet unless something far larger and more destructive was planned. Hiroshi was flying one of the few Kit K-84 SIRD in his entire regiment, still capable of reaching its designed performance. Fuel cut with impurities and worn-out engines meant most squadrons could no longer climb above 25,000 feet, leaving them helpless against daylight. B-29 raids. But tonight's low altitude meant that for the first time in months, Japanese fighters could intercept before the bombs fell. He climbed through 5,000 feet, feeling the Hayate's controls tighten as he gained airspeed, and mentally reviewed the attack patterns drilled into every interceptor pilot, head-on passes that required perfect timing, shallow diving attacks aimed at the engines, and breakaway maneuvers to avoid the inevitable wall of .50 caliber fire. These tactics had worked against the B-17 and the B-24, aircraft whose gunners fought from exposed positions, freezing in the slipstream, manually tracking targets through narrow arcs of fire. But the B-29 was different, impossibly different. Hiroshi had already survived attempts that ended in tracer storms, so dense they illuminated the sky like lightning, and every time he had flown away shaken by the sense that the bomber had seen him coming from impossible angles. Below him, the coastline slipped into darkness. Above him, the first silhouettes appeared, 36 B-29s stretched across the horizon, black shapes against the faint haze of starlight, engines glowing red at their exhausts as they droned toward the capital. Hiroshi throttled forward, drew his fighter into position ahead of the formation, and prepared for a steep, decisive head-on attack. At 800 yards he inverted, pulled into a controlled dive, and watched the lead bomber swell in his gun sight, its entire forward section gleaming faintly through the nose glazing. He opened fire 2 20mm cannons, spitting explosive shells through the darkness, and braced for the familiar return fire from the tail or waist positions. But what happened next did not resemble any engagement Hiroshi had ever survived. The defensive fire did not come from one direction. It came from all of them. From above, below, and both sides, converging on his Ki-84 in a synchronized storm of tracers so dense that for a moment the night sky became a spinning cage of red-white arcs, tracking his fighter not like human gunners but like instruments, predicting his dive, matching his roll rate, and following his evasive turn even after he broke away. 3 seconds. That was all it took for a single B-29 to inflict more damage than an entire formation of fortresses. As Hiroshi yanked the Hayate into a punishing 6 GRU, hearing the metallic hammer of impacts through his fuselage, he understood something no Japanese pilot had yet put into words. The B-29's guns were not being aimed by men. The bomber was fighting with something else, something coordinated, something faster than human reflexes, something calculating every variable of his movement in real time. And that realization was only the beginning. Hiroshi leveled off at 10,000 feet, his Ki-84 trembling from the violent evasive maneuver, the instruments flickering as electrical systems struggled to stabilize, and he looked down through his canopy at the spectacle, unfolding beneath him. 3 full squadrons of Japanese fighters diving in sequence toward the B-29 stream, each pilot convinced that low altitude meant opportunity, each one unaware that they were flying into the most sophisticated defensive system ever mounted on an aircraft in the Second World War. The sky below resembled a furnace lit from within as the first incendiary clusters detonated over eastern Tokyo, their bomblets scattering like sparks from a giant torch, igniting rooftops, warehouses, and entire districts in seconds, the glow rising upward in a column of fire that seemed to swallow the night. He watched Sergeant Tanaka begin his attack run, a perfect head-on approach drilled endlessly on dusty airfields during months of frantic training. Tanaka fired a long burst, tracers streaking toward the lead bomber, then 3 separate turrets pivoted at once, their .50 caliber barrels locking onto his trajectory with mechanical certainty, and Hiroshi saw the streams of fire intersect Tanaka's cockpit in a cross of red light before the Ki-84 vanished, in a single white flash, fragments scattering across the darkness like embers carried by the wind. No gunner could have achieved that level of synchronization. No human could track a target, accelerating, rolling, and diving simultaneously from multiple angles. Only a system could. Only a machine. Hiroshi felt the truth settling over him with the weight of inevitability. The B-29 was not a bomber, defended by gunners. It was a bomber defended by a computer, an integrated fire control network, linking every turret, every sight, and every firing solution into a single coordinated response. The Americans didn't need 10 perfect gunners. They needed one operator with a stable sight picture and a central computer calculating ballistic trajectories faster than any Japanese pilot could alter his line of attack. The moment one gunner acquired a target, every turret capable of bearing on that target did so automatically, adjusting for altitude, range, angle, wind drift, and parallax, all within fractions of a second. And for Japan's already strained fighter squadrons, it meant one thing. Their tactics from 1942 were useless in 1945. Below, 2 more Ki-84s climbed into attack position, attempting a pincer assault from above and below, an evolved tactic designed specifically to overwhelm the B-24's manually operated positions. But the B-29 didn't react like a B-24. 2 turrets, one dorsal, one ventral, swiveled simultaneously, their movements smooth, almost fluid, as if guided by an invisible hand, and the overlapping arcs of fire forced both attackers to break away before they could fire a second burst. One escaped trailing thin smoke, the other peeled off in a spiraling descent that ended in the black water of Tokyo Bay. Hiroshi exhaled slowly, feeling the sick pressure of realization tightening around his mind. The Americans had built a weapon Japan could not counter, and every pilot climbing into a cockpit that night was discovering it the same way he had. 3 seconds of contact, followed by disaster. He scanned the formation again and saw a brief opening beneath one of the trailing bombers, an angle where the lower rear turret had limited depression, and the tail guns couldn't traverse quickly enough to track a fast climbing attacker. It was a narrow gap, a blind spot not in the enemy's technology, but in its geometry, and Hiroshi felt the instinctive pull of desperation, the drive that pushed fighter pilots to exploit even the smallest advantage when the alternative was to watch helplessly as their city burned. He rolled into position, pushed the throttle into the red, and descended until the B-29's vast silhouette loomed above him like a metal cliff against the flames rising from Tokyo, then pulled back hard on the stick and drove his Ki-84 upward in a near-vertical climb, his engine screaming at full boost as the bomber filled his gun sight. For 2 seconds, 2 perfect, golden seconds, he had a clear shot. At 300 yards he opened fire, twin streams of 20 tracer ripping into the bomber's belly, sparks leaping across its fuselage as armor-piercing shells punched through the bomb bay doors and detonated inside the aircraft. He saw a flash, maybe a ruptured oxygen line, maybe an incendiary bomblet cooking off early. But then the turret moved, slowly at first, then with growing precision, as if the computer needed only a moment to comprehend the geometry of his attack. The muzzle flashes bloomed beneath the B-29 like a row of tiny suns, and Hiroshi felt the first impact tear through his left wing, followed by another, then another, each blow transmitted through the airframe like a hammer strike. Fuel. He smelled fuel. A cold, metallic vapor, seeping into the cockpit, mixing with the lingering smell of cordite and engine oil, and he knew the next round could ignite the wing and end his life in a sheet of fire. He rolled inverted, dove away from the formation, and felt the Hayate shudder violently as hydraulic fluid streamed from ruptured lines, the controls growing sluggish beneath his hands. He had been in firing range for less than 2 seconds, and the B-29 had nearly killed him. Below him, Tokyo was burning now, not in patches but in waves, long corridors of flame racing through densely packed neighborhoods, the firestorm pulling oxygen from the air so fiercely that smoke spiraled upward in towering vortices, visible even from 10,000 feet. The heat rising from the city struck the underside of his fighter in turbulent pulses, lifting and dropping the aircraft as if the very atmosphere was convulsing. Hiroshi steadied the Ki-84 and turned toward Narimasu airfield, knowing the landing would be difficult, knowing the hydraulics were failing, knowing the left wing was so peppered with .50 caliber holes that lift itself was a prayer. And still, the only thought repeating in his mind was not fear and not survival, but a realization as cold and hard as steel. We cannot defeat this. Not this machine. Not this bomber. Not this war. As Hiroshi pulled away from the American formation, and from the rising red glow that clung to the horizon like a second dawn, he felt his aircraft trembling beneath him, like a wounded animal still desperate to run. Every shudder of the left wing, reminding him that the structure had been ripped open by dozens of impacts, the leaking hydraulic fluid staining the fuselage, and turning even the smallest control correction into a deliberate act of force, while below him the sky pulsed with the orange breath of burning districts, a clear sign that the Americans had not come merely to hit industrial targets, but to convert Tokyo into an open furnace. Climbing slowly, trying to stabilize the Ki-84's altitude, despite the worsening aerodynamics, he watched the surviving Japanese fighters scatter around him, some trailing thick black smoke, some with entire panels missing from their wings, others descending erratically, as if the pilots were fighting not the bombers, but the very air that resisted their commands. And every one of these crippled silhouettes told the same story, that bravery, experience, and 3 years of attritional combat flying had become irrelevant against a weapon that no longer fought according to the logic of human reflexes. A weapon whose defenses were governed not by cold or exhaustion or fear, but by silent calculations, unfolding faster than any pilot could maneuver. The image of the B-29's belly turret returned to him with painful clarity, that smooth, glass-like dome rotating toward him, with a movement so fluid it resembled a living creature, rather than a mechanical assembly. And he remembered a vague rumor he had once heard at the airfield, a whispered report that the Americans were using a centralized fire control system, a machine capable of computing target angles and trajectories in real time. But nothing in the briefing notes had prepared him for what he had just experienced in combat. Because this was not simply a mechanical aid for human gunners, it was a replacement for them, an analog brain that anticipated speed, direction, evasive intent, and firing geometry with a precision that no Japanese pilot had imagined possible. And now, as he struggled to keep his aircraft level. He felt a cold, sinking certainty that what he had encountered was not merely an advantage, but a glimpse of Japan's inevitable defeat. Tokyo was burning with a violence that defied imagination, the flames merging under the strong night wind into continuous rivers of fire that devoured wooden neighborhoods in minutes, the rising heat creating powerful updrafts that twisted columns of smoke into towering black cyclones, visible even from 10,000 feet, and Hiroshi could feel his aircraft buffeted by turbulence, caused not by weather, but by the very destruction of the capital below. Yet he had no time to dwell on the enormity of what he saw, because the gauges in his cockpit told their own grim story, fuel pressure dropping sharply, hydraulic systems almost empty, temperatures oscillating dangerously, and he knew that every remaining kilometer of flight would require concentration bordering on desperation. He turned westward toward Narimasu airfield, palms sweating against the control stick, trying to ignore the unnatural heaviness in the Ki-84's movements. And as he followed the dim coastline, he saw 3 more Hi-8s limping home, each one scarred with the same signature of impossibility. Wings drilled with neat rows of .50 caliber holes, fuselages punctured as though by a giant sewing machine, control surfaces half shredded, all bearing the unmistakable marks of a defensive system that did not miss once it began firing. At that moment, Hiroshi understood something that no intelligence report, no briefing, and no officer had ever said aloud. Japanese pilots no longer shaped the air war. They were reacting to a machine that had already rewritten the rules. When the faint outline of Narimasu finally emerged from the darkness, lit only by a few shielded lamps, barely sufficient for landing, Hiroshi lowered the landing gear manually, feeling the grinding resistance of a hydraulic system close to total failure, and he realized that if one wheel locked, the Ki-84 would flip immediately, turning the runway into a death sentence. But he had no choice, because the engine was coughing now, starved of fuel, sputtering with each second as if it, too, understood that its time was running out. He reduced throttle, felt the aircraft settle, and at the last possible moment eased back on the stick, touching down in a long sliding skid that sent up clouds of dust and smoke before the fighter finally came to a jarring, uneven stop. When he opened the canopy, the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the sharp smell of evaporated gasoline, and the mechanics who ran toward him with extinguishers and lanterns froze for a moment, staring at the left wing, wholly and shredded like woven bamboo after a typhoon, and at the fuel lines that had been nearly severed in multiple places. One of the men whispered, almost in disbelief, that no aircraft so damaged had any right to still be flying. And as Hiroshi climbed down the side of the fuselage, boots touching the cold concrete, he looked at his Hayate, at the jagged wounds covering every surface, and understood that his survival was not a testament to skill or training, but sheer chance. And in that moment, with the glow of Tokyo's inferno reflecting against the clouds, Hiroshi understood with absolute clarity that the battle he had just fought was not merely a clash between pilots and aircraft, but a confrontation between eras of engineering, one rooted in instinct, courage, and human endurance, and the other built on mathematics, electronics, industrial power, and computation, and no amount of honor or sacrifice could compensate for the growing gulf between them. By the time Hiroshi stepped away from his battered Ki-84 and felt the ground beneath his boots, instead of the trembling airframe, the distant thunder of the B-29 formation had already faded into the night, replaced by the continuous roar of Tokyo burning, a sound unlike anything he had ever heard, a low, unbroken growl created by thousands of structures collapsing, millions of objects igniting, and entire neighborhoods being consumed by a single expanding firestorm that was feeding on itself with predatory hunger, pulling oxygen from the air so violently that a hot wind swept across the runway like the breath of an enormous furnace. He turned toward the city, watching the horizon pulse in orange waves, and for a moment he imagined the cockpit of the bomber he had hit, only 2 seconds of fire, only a handful of shells striking home, and yet perhaps inside that vast metal machine, perhaps unseen from where he stood, a gunner or radio operator was fighting smoke, or a navigator was scrambling to isolate a fuel leak, or the pilot was coaxing his superfortress back toward the sea, and the thought struck Hiroshi with a sharp, unexpected clarity. Even the enemy, armed with technology beyond anything Japan could match, was still human, still vulnerable, still struggling inside the very machines that granted them such overwhelming superiority. But that human vulnerability did not change the reality he now understood, because what had unfolded in the skies over Tokyo was not an exchange of skill between pilots, not a duel of maneuver or courage, but a demonstration of a new paradigm. An air war dictated by computation, by industrial scale, by engineering so advanced that it rendered traditional fighter tactics obsolete the moment the B-29 entered service. A shift so profound that even the most experienced Japanese aviators, men who had survived years of deadly combat, could do little more than throw themselves at a machine that anticipated their moves before they made them. As Hiroshi walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the operations shack, the gravel cracking softly beneath his boots, he saw the remaining pilots of the 47th Sentai gathering in the dim light, their flight suits stained with smoke, faces blackened by oil and exhaustion, some sitting on the ground with their helmets still in their hands, others bent over, shaking, murmuring half-coherent descriptions of what they had encountered: turrets that moved with uncanny speed, tracers that curved in perfect alignment with their attacks, guns that opened fire before they had even completed their dives. And each pilot, even the veterans with hundreds of flying hours, carried the same stunned expression, the same haunted realization that the enemy's bomber was no longer a collection of gunners, but an interconnected, coordinated defensive organism. The squadron leader, a major known for his calm and measured tone, tried to speak but halted when he heard the numbers being reported. 8 fighters launched, 3 returned, 5 missing or confirmed destroyed. No B-29 soldier shot down, no damage inflicted except for the minor hit Hiroshi had scored. The major stared at the map table, his hand trembling as he traced the path of the American raid, and for the first time Hiroshi saw uncertainty in the man's eyes, the unspoken acknowledgement that the Sentai had just been dismantled by a single technological innovation, an analog computer no larger than a field desk, housed inside the bomber's pressurized interior, linking all turrets with perfect mathematical precision. As messages from other airfields came in, reports of similar losses, similar disasters, similar accounts of Japanese fighters being torn apart by converging streams of fire, a pattern emerged, unmistakable and terrifying. The defenders of the Empire were fighting an enemy who had already moved one step ahead in the evolution of aerial warfare, shifting from human-centered defense to machine-directed lethality, a transition that Japan's strained industry, limited resources, and collapsing logistics could not hope to replicate. Somewhere far above, invisible beyond the smoke and ash, the last stragglers of the B-29 formation were turning toward the sea, their bomb bay doors closed, their engines droning with steady confidence, and Hiroshi felt a moment of bitter admiration for the aircraft that had nearly killed him twice in the same hour. Its vast wings unmarred by frost, its remote turrets responding to threats with inhuman speed, its analog computers humming quietly behind armored panels, calculating angles and velocities with silent, tireless precision. He sank onto a wooden bench outside the operations hut, the cold night air prickling against his sweat-soaked flight suit, and stared at his hands that had once believed skill, instinct, and bravery were enough to win battles, and realized with a heavy, unresolvable clarity that the war had shifted into a realm where those qualities mattered less than circuitry, manufacturing capacity, and the ability to integrate weapons into coherent, interdependent networks. The other pilots remained silent, watching the glow of Tokyo's destruction paint the clouds in rolling waves of red and gold. And in that silence hung a truth. None of them wished to speak aloud. Japan could no longer challenge the Americans in the skies above their own homeland, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked the machines that turned courage into effectiveness. And as the night deepened, with the fires of Tokyo climbing higher into the sky, Hiroshi understood that what he had witnessed was not simply a failed interception, but a glimpse of the future of warfare. A future in which the victor would not be the side with the boldest pilots, but the one whose machines could think, calculate, and kill faster than any human ever could. As dawn crept over the eastern horizon, its pale, indifferent light revealing the skeletal remains of Tokyo's districts still smoldering beneath columns of drifting ash, Hiroshi stood near the edge of the airfield and watched the extent of the devastation unfold in slow, agonizing detail, each minute revealing more clearly that the raid he had failed to stop was not merely another air attack, but a turning point, a moment when the air war over Japan had shifted irreversibly in the enemy's favor, shaped not by pilot skill or courage, but by the cold inevitability of technological escalation. The wind carried the acrid smell of burned wood and charred rubber from the capital, a thick, suffocating odor that clung to the back of his throat as he struggled to comprehend what had happened during those brief hours before midnight. And as he looked out across the runway, now littered with fragments of shattered canopy glass, discarded ammunition belts, and the dark stains left behind by leaking hydraulic fluid from half-destroyed fighters, he felt a heaviness settle in his chest, the crushing awareness that Japan's air defenses were collapsing, not from lack of effort, but from the sheer impossibility of confronting a machine designed to neutralize every tactic they had ever practiced. A supply officer approached him, carrying a clipboard smeared with dust and oil, and quietly informed him that the 47th Sentai's remaining aircraft would be grounded for at least 48 hours, not because mechanic crews were unwilling to work, but because there were no spare parts left, no new ailerons, no replacement engine blocks, no hydraulic pumps, no functional radios, only a handful of cannibalized components pulled from wrecks lined up behind the hangars, like tombstones of aluminum and steel. The officer did not need to say what both men already understood. Even if all surviving fighters were repaired, even if every pilot returned to the skies, the next encounter with the B-29s would produce the same result, because the problem was not the pilots or the aircraft, but the enemy's fire control system. A technological climax Japan had no time left to counter. Inside the command hut, senior officers muttered over maps and casualty lists, voices low and defeated, discussing with forced objectivity the same grim reality that Hiroshi had already accepted, that traditional interception strategies had failed, that altitude advantage no longer mattered when the Americans could choose to fly high or low with equal impunity, and that every attempt to redesign their tactics in response to the B-29's remote turret system would be little more than improvisation against a weapon engineered from the beginning to dominate the skies. They spoke of night attacks, of formation assaults, of massed climbs designed to overwhelm the bomber stream. But none of the proposals contained even a fragment of hope, because the central fire control system rendered every angle of approach equally vulnerable, every maneuver equally predictable, and every burst of cannon fire equally futile. Hiroshi listened in silence as the intelligence officer described, in meticulous detail, the inner workings of the B-29's analog computers, how gyroscopic stabilizers measured target motion, how electromechanical calculators predicted lead vectors, how parallax adjusters aligned guns with sighting stations, how the entire system compensated for wind drift and bomber movement with mathematical precision. And in that moment he realized with chilling clarity that the Americans had not merely built a bomber, they had built an aerial fortress governed by equations, a weapon that removed human weakness from the core of its defense and replaced it with a logic that could not be intimidated, outmaneuvered, or exhausted. The officers fell silent for a moment as a runner burst into the room to report that another pilot, Sergeant Ito, whose aircraft had gone missing during the intercept, had washed ashore near Yokohama, his parachute unopened, his body battered by the surf, and the news settled over the room like a physical weight, tightening the air around them, as if even the walls recoiled at the cost of the night's battle. Hiroshi closed his eyes briefly, remembering the flash he had seen near the bay, wondering if that had been Ito's fighter being torn apart by a converging storm of .50 caliber fire. And the image made his stomach twist with helplessness, because he knew Ito had died not from lack of skill, but from the futility of human reflexes against a machine that calculated faster than any man could react. As noon approached, commanders delivered the final assessment, Japan had lost 126 aircraft, attempting to intercept the B-29 fleet across multiple bases, while the Americans had lost only 14 bombers, numbers that revealed the imbalance of the conflict with brutal clarity. Numbers that required no interpretation, numbers that told every pilot, mechanic, and strategist that the age of conventional air defense was over. Hiroshi walked outside again. As the sun climbed higher, its weak winter light illuminating the long line of damaged Ki-84s, waiting for repairs that might never come, and he felt the same crushing realization that had followed him through the night, settling deeper into his bones. Japan could not win the air war, not because its pilots lacked courage, not because its aircraft were fatally inferior, but because the enemy had mastered the integration of technology, industry, and firepower into a single system that amplified every strength and erased every weakness. The roar of distant fires continued to echo from Tokyo, merging with the metallic clatter of tools and the shouted commands of ground crews, and Hiroshi stood motionless for a long moment, understanding at last that what he had survived was not only a battle but a message, a warning that the skies of Japan now belonged to machines whose capabilities surpassed anything his nation could build or even imagine. And as he gazed at the horizon, still glowing faintly from the dying embers of the firestorm, he felt an uneasy certainty that history would remember this night not for the destruction it caused, but for the revelation it delivered, that the future of warfare would be shaped not by the bravery of individuals, but by the relentless, calculating precision of technology. By late afternoon, the ash had begun to drift down over Narimasu airfield like a slow, grey snowfall, coating the wings of grounded fighters and settling into the cracks of the runway, and Hiroshi watched it accumulate with a sense of surreal detachment, because he understood that the particles floating gently around him were the remains of thousands of homes, tens of thousands of lives, and entire neighborhoods now reduced to cinders. The ash was the physical proof that the Americans had achieved what the Japanese air defense network could no longer prevent, that the capital had become a battlefield no fighter squadron could defend. Mechanics moved silently between aircraft, their faces smeared with oil and soot, examining shattered control surfaces and ruptured fuel lines, taking careful notes that they already knew would mean little, because even if they patched the holes and replaced the torn metal, the next encounter with the B-29 Armada would undo their work within minutes. The men spoke in hushed voices, exchanging glances heavy with the awareness that they were fighting not merely fatigue and limited supplies, but an enemy whose machines inflicted damage faster than Japan could repair it. Hiroshi, standing beside his battered Ki-84, ran his hand along the ragged edges of the bullet holes that perforated the wing, each one a reminder of how close he had come to being cut in half by converging streams of .50 caliber fire, and he knew that luck, not skill, had brought him back alive. When the squadron commander finally emerged from the operations hut, his uniform flecked with ash, and his expression fixed in a grim, exhausted neutrality, the pilots instinctively gathered around him, forming a semicircle on the windswept tarmac, as he delivered the assessment that every man already anticipated. The air defense doctrine of the previous 3 years was no longer viable. The B-29's central fire control system rendered traditional interception tactics ineffective, and new methods would have to be devised immediately if Japanese fighter units were to have any chance of inflicting meaningful losses on the enemy. Yet even as he spoke, his tone steady and authoritative, the subtext was unmistakable. These new tactics would not be improvements born of innovation, but desperate compromises crafted in the shadow of defeat. The proposals were as bleak as they were predictable. Nighttime interceptions using the cover of darkness to disrupt the B-29 gunners' optical sights, massed attacks in which entire squadrons would climb together, hoping that the sheer number of fighters might overwhelm the computer-guided turrets, shallow diving assaults from oblique angles meant to confuse the fire control system's tracking mechanism, and most ominously, an adaptation of ramming tactics, air-to-air kamikaze strikes distributed across the bomber stream to compensate for the declining effectiveness of conventional weaponry. As Hiroshi listened, he felt a tightening in his chest, an instinctive resistance to the idea that the only reliable way to bring down a B-29 might soon be the destruction of the pilot attempting it. The officers continued their briefing, outlining the staggering losses suffered not only by Narimas, but by bases across Honshu, more than 100 fighters destroyed in the night's chaos, dozens of experienced pilots dead, missing or wounded, and all of it inflicted by a bomber whose defensive fire was so overwhelmingly coordinated that no Japanese formation had managed to crack it. They spoke of intelligence intercepts, suggesting that American engineers had refined the analog computers even further, improving turret synchronization and sight stabilization, and every sentence painted the same bleak picture. Japan's aviation industry, already strained by shortages of aluminum fuel and skilled labor, stood no chance of producing anything remotely comparable in the time remaining. As dusk approached and the sky darkened to a bruised blue, Hiroshi stepped away from the briefing, needing space to process what he had heard, and he walked toward the far edge of the airfield where the broken remains of aircraft had been dragged during the night. Burned cockpits, twisted wings, shattered propellers, each wreck reflecting the silent testimony of a pilot who would never return. He paused beside one fuselage, whose paint had been scorched away, revealing bare metal warped by the explosion that had killed its pilot, and he wondered whether that man had seen in his final seconds the same impossible convergence of tracer fire that had nearly torn Hiroshi's own fighter apart. He stood there for a long while, the cold air brushing against his face, the faint smell of burned wood drifting from the city, and he realized that Japan was losing not because its pilots were inferior, but because its machines belonged to an earlier chapter of the war, a time when human reflexes and tactical ingenuity could overcome material disadvantages, a time before the battlefield had been reshaped by computational fire control, mass production, and the industrial mathematics of American warfare. When he finally turned back toward the hangars, the first new orders of the evening were already being posted on the operations board: emergency night readiness, immediate sortie drills, revised intercept procedures, and a list of pilots assigned to experimental ramming formations. He saw his own name on the roster for night intercept duty and felt no fear, only a deep, aching certainty that the next time he rose into the sky, the machine waiting for him above the burning capital would be the same unstoppable force, executing calculations faster than he could think, anticipating his moves before he made them, and treating his presence not as a threat but as an input variable to be neutralized. And as the final light of day faded behind the smoke-filled horizon, Hiroshi understood that the era of instinct-driven aerial duels was ending, replaced by a new age in which victory belonged not to the bravest pilot, but to the nation that could build the fastest, smartest, most relentless machines, an age that Japan, exhausted and isolated, was no longer capable of entering. Night settled over Narimasu airfield with a heaviness that felt almost physical, a thick, suffocating darkness interrupted only by the glow of distant fires still burning inside Tokyo's ruined districts, their flickering light casting long, wavering shadows across the parked aircraft and turning the airfield into a dim tableau of silhouettes. Mechanics hunched over open-engine cowlings, officers moving like ghosts between command huts, and pilots sitting alone beside their damaged fighters, each man grappling with the knowledge that the war had entered a phase in which survival depended less on courage and more on the whims of machines far beyond their control. Hiroshi remained near the dispersal area long after most of the base had gone quiet, leaning against the cool metal of his Kid's 84 as he watched the embers of Tokyo reflect against the low clouds, and he found himself replaying the moments of the previous night with a clarity that bordered on obsession. The instant he had rolled inverted into his attack dive, the brief pulse of confidence when his cannons found the belly of the B-29, and the sudden eruption of impossible, converging tracer fire that had turned his assault into a frantic struggle for survival. He understood now that the Americans had not been reacting to him. They had been calculating him, processing his velocity, angle, altitude, and rate of closure with a precision that no human gunner could match, and the realization that his every maneuver had been reduced to numerical data in the circuits of an analog computer sent a chill through him far colder than the winter air. Inside the operations shack, senior officers debated in low, urgent voices the changes that would be required to make future interceptions even remotely feasible. And although the walls were too thick for Hiroshi to hear their exact words, he already knew the conclusions they were reaching. Japan would need to throw more fighters at each raid, perhaps dozens per bomber stream. They would need to fly at night, forcing B-29 gunners to rely on reduced visibility. They would need to adopt ramming tactics, not as a desperate last resort, but as a routine component of their strategy. And even then, even if every tactic succeeded perfectly, the cost would be catastrophic, because the Americans could replace their aircraft and their crews far faster than Japan could replace its own. It was a calculus of attrition that Japan had already lost, and yet the war demanded that they continue to fight, sortie after sortie, until the skies themselves were emptied of defenders. A lieutenant from the communications unit approached Hiroshi with a sheet of decoded intelligence, and the young man's expression was tight, strained, as though he struggled to keep emotion from breaking through the professionalism expected of him. The report contained preliminary assessments from multiple bases across Honshu, all confirming the same pattern: massive losses among Japanese fighter units, minimal losses among the B-29 groups, and detailed observations of the analog fire control system's performance, which had proven devastatingly consistent, regardless of altitude, approach angle, or weather conditions. Hiroshi read the document slowly, letting each line sink into him, and the deeper he went, the more he felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on his shoulders, because this was not simply a new weapon, but a new philosophy of warfare, one in which the human element had been deliberately minimized in favor of mechanical precision and industrial reliability. Later, as he walked along the dimly lit perimeter of the airfield, the cold wind carrying with it the distant crackle of fires still devouring the city, he passed the wreckage yard where the remains of downed fighters had been dragged earlier in the morning, and he found himself drawn toward one particular airframe, a Ki-84 belonging to Sergeant Tanaka, the same aircraft he had watched explode in mid-air when 3 B-29 turrets converged on it during the head-on assault. The wreck was barely recognizable, its nose section crushed, its tail twisted at an unnatural angle, and Hiroshi stared at it with an almost reverent silence, feeling the strange combination of grief and resignation that came when confronting the physical consequences of technological imbalance. Tanaka had been a skilled pilot, disciplined, fearless, the kind of man who could have held his own against any American fighter, but he had been annihilated in seconds by a bomber that had turned its guns toward him with a coordination and accuracy no human reflex could hope to counter. As the hours passed and the cold deepened, Hiroshi's thoughts drifted toward the future, a future in which Japan would be forced to rely increasingly on desperation measures, pilots with only a handful of training hours sent into combat, experimental aircraft rushed into service without refinement, strategies that prioritized damage over survival, and a grim acceptance that technology, not bravery, would determine the outcomes of battles. He realized with painful clarity that the war had reached a point where individual valor could no longer influence the tide, because the Americans had built a machine designed not only to endure attacks, but to anticipate them, to neutralize them, and to punish them with relentless precision. Standing alone beneath the cold, smoky sky, Hiroshi felt the full weight of the transformation unfolding around him, not just the destruction of Tokyo, not just the losses suffered by his squadron, but the death of an era in which a pilot's skill had been the deciding force in aerial warfare. That era had ended the moment the B-29's central fire control system came online, and the age that replaced it belonged to the nations capable of merging industrial might with mechanical intelligence, an age that Japan, for all its spirit and determination, could not enter quickly enough to survive. And as the night wore on, Hiroshi understood with unshakable certainty that the next time he climbed into his cockpit, the battle awaiting him would not be against American pilots, but against the silent, tireless, calculating machines hidden inside the belly of the Superfortress, machines that would mark his presence, track his movement, compute his intentions, and unleash their fire long before he could pull the trigger. Dawn on the following morning did nothing to lift the weight that hung over Narimasu airfield. Instead, the pale sunlight simply revealed with brutal clarity the scale of the previous night's destruction, illuminating the scorched horizon. The drifting smoke rising from Tokyo like the breath of a wounded giant, and the battered Japanese fighters scattered across the tarmac like relics from a previous era, their patched wings and shattered canopies, a silent confession that the war they were built for no longer existed. Hiroshi stood beside a row of aircraft awaiting inspection. The cold metal of their fuselages still marked by the soot carried on the night wind, and as he watched the mechanics crawl over each plane with exhausted efficiency, checking bullet-ridden panels, examining torn hydraulic lines, logging structural failures, he felt a growing sense of futility because he knew, as every man on the airfield now knew, that repairing these machines would only ready them for another encounter with an enemy whose defensive fire outpaced human reaction, whose turrets moved with mathematical precision, and whose gunners operated in the safety of a pressurized cabin, guided by the whisper-quiet hum of analog computers that turned every Japanese fighter approaching the bomber stream into an equation to be solved. Inside the command shack, officers studied reconnaissance photographs of the burned districts, their somber expressions reflecting the grim reality that the American raid had achieved exactly what it intended. Over 16 square miles of Tokyo consumed in a single night, over 100,000 civilians killed, and the city's defenses left fractured not only materially but psychologically. Reports from other airfields confirmed that the B-29s' low-altitude tactics had been deliberately designed to maximize chaos. Incendiary patterns dropped in overlapping grids, bombers spaced to create unbroken walls of fire, and defensive turrets positioned to repel interceptors from every angle at any altitude. The strategy was not merely destructive, it was methodical, scientific, and devastatingly efficient. Hiroshi listened as intelligence officers reviewed the technical breakdown of the central fire control system once more, explaining that each B-29 carried 5 remotely operated turrets controlled from inside the aircraft by gunner stations, equipped with optical sights connected to an analog computer capable of calculating deflection based on target speed, angle, distance, and the bomber's own movement. And even as the officers spoke with clinical precision, he felt a strange sense of awe at the realization that the Americans had, years before, predicted exactly the kind of air war they would need to fight, one that would require not just brave crews but machines capable of integrating information faster than any human brain could process it. The more he listened, the clearer it became that Japan's fate had been sealed long before his squadron took off the previous night. The war had been determined not in the skies over Tokyo, but in the factories of Wichita, Washington, and Nebraska, where thousands of workers assembled the Superfortress under a doctrine of industrial warfare that Japan's limited resources could never hope to match. The B-29 was the culmination of that philosophy, pressurized, remote-controlled, logic-driven, a bomber that carried not just bombs, but the distilled essence of American manufacturing capacity. Outside, as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher, Hiroshi noticed a small group of young pilots gathered near the hangar, new recruits, barely 20 years old, recently assigned to the 47th Sentai, as replacements for the ones who had not returned. Their uniforms were crisp, their eyes bright with the naive determination of men who had grown up under wartime propaganda, and he felt a heaviness in his chest as he watched them being led toward their aircraft. Listening carefully as instructors explained tactics that had already been rendered obsolete by the B-29's defensive network, he wondered how many of them would survive their first encounter with the bomber stream. How many would understand too late that courage alone could not penetrate the machine-driven curtain of fire waiting for them above Tokyo. Later that afternoon, while sitting beside his damaged KISS 84, Hiroshi overheard an officer speaking in hushed tones about the future of the war, discussing rumors of new American weapons, of even larger bombers being prepared, of destructive capabilities beyond anything Japan had yet experienced, and he felt a sinking certainty that the technological imbalance between the two nations would only widen in the coming months. The Americans had not only achieved superiority in the air, they had rewritten the principles of aerial combat, merging mathematics, machinery, and mass production into a form of warfare that Japan, with its dwindling fuel reserves and exhausted pilots, simply could not counter. He looked once more toward the distant edge of the city, where a faint column of smoke still rose from the ruins, and he understood that the battle of the previous night had not been an isolated disaster, but a glimpse of all the raids yet to come. The B-29 Sir would return, again and again, with the same mechanical precision, the same relentless coordination, the same impenetrable defensive network, and each time the Japanese fighters would rise to meet them, only to be broken by a weapon that could think faster, aim faster, and kill faster than any man in a cockpit. And as evening approached once again, Hiroshi felt the unmistakable, crushing truth settle into his bones. The war in the air was no longer a contest between pilots or aircraft. It was a collision between two worlds, one driven by tradition and courage, the other by computation and industry, and the latter was advancing with a momentum that Japan had no means of stopping. As the sun dipped once more toward the western horizon, casting long amber beams across the airfield and painting the damaged fighters in tones of gold and rust, Hiroshi felt the quiet of evening settle into the cracks of Narimasu like a final layer of ash, a stillness broken only by the occasional clatter of tools or the distant rumble of transport trucks, ferrying the wounded from Tokyo's burning ruins. Yet beneath this veneer of calm lay the unmistakable tension of a nation that understood, consciously or not, that the foundations of its air defense had crumbled in a single catastrophic night. Every officer on the base moved with a kind of subdued urgency, their voices low, their discussions clipped, as if speaking too loudly would acknowledge the scale of the disaster they were trying so desperately to pass into actionable terms. In the operations hunt, the heat from a single oil lamp flickered across maps, dotted with new symbols, triangles representing destroyed aircraft, circles representing missing pilots, and thick red arrows showing the path of the B-29's incendiary grid pattern. And as Hiroshi stood at the doorway, listening to the officers frame their decisions with a mixture of exhaustion and grim determination, he realized that the situation had passed beyond the realm of strategy and into the realm of survival. Messages arriving from regional command offered little hope. Reports indicated that American forces were expanding their network of forward bases across the Marianas and the Philippines, increasing the frequency and scale of their bombing missions, while Japanese radar stations along the coastline were being systematically overwhelmed by coordinated waves of bombers and electronic interference. The Americans were not simply attacking Japan, they were perfecting a methodical system for dismantling its infrastructure, its industry, and its ability to resist. The B-29 was merely the visible spear point of an entire doctrine designed to make resistance futile. Hiroshi, leaning against the doorframe and listening to a communications officer, described sightings of additional bomber groups assembling hundreds of kilometers offshore, felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him with greater force than any moment in combat. He knew now that the Americans had achieved a degree of air superiority, so absolute that even the attempt to challenge them had become an act of near-suicidal defiance. Yet what troubled him even more deeply was the realization that this superiority was not built on a single innovation, but on an entire ecosystem of technological evolution, each component reinforcing the others in a way that magnified their effectiveness: radar-guided navigation, long-range planning, pressurized cabins, industrial manufacturing, and at the core of it all, the central fire control system that turned each B-29 into a self-sufficient defensive citadel. Stepping outside again, he felt the evening chill tighten around him, and he walked toward the southern end of the runway, where he saw a group of young mechanics pulling the tarp from a newly arrived Ki-84, one of only 2 replacement fighters allocated to their squadron, despite the losses they had sustained. The aircraft gleamed under the fading light, its paint fresh, its fuselage unmarred by enemy fire, yet to Hiroshi it looked more fragile than any machine he had flown. The Hayate was a superb fighter, fast, powerful, beautifully responsive, but in facing the B-29, it was like a sword swung against a fortress wall, brave but hopeless. Nearby, 2 pilots sat on overturned fuel drums, their silhouettes dark against the glow of Tokyo's distant flames, and Hiroshi approached them quietly, listening as they murmured about the families they had in the city, their wives, their parents, the children they hoped were safe. Yet every sentence carried the unspoken fear that the destruction unleashed the previous night had already swept away people they loved. The war was no longer distant, no longer fought on seas far from home. It had arrived on their doorsteps with a brutality so sudden that the mind struggled to grasp its scale. As darkness deepened, the base loudspeakers crackled to life, announcing the new night intercept schedule, and Hiroshi felt his pulse quicken as he heard his own designation among those assigned to first readiness. His fighter was damaged, yes, but still flyable, and the officers were determined to put every aircraft in the air for the next raid, regardless of its condition or the pilot's exhaustion. It was a decision born of necessity, but also of resignation. Japan would meet the next wave of B-29s, not with improved technology or refined tactics, but with whatever remained. Walking back to his aircraft, he paused once more to take in the sight of Tokyo's burning skyline, the orange glow staining the underside of the clouds like a permanent sunset. And he felt an eerie sensation as he realized that the same glow which illuminated the night was also illuminating the truth he had been avoiding. That Japan stood on the threshold of a collapse, not measured in battles won or lost, but in a technological disparity so vast that bravery could do little more than delay the inevitable. And as the first stars pierced the smoke-laden sky, Hiroshi understood with stark finality that the next time he took to the air, he would be flying not simply into combat, but into a demonstration of a new era of warfare, one governed not by human instinct, but by machines that could outthink, outshoot, and outlast any pilot Japan could place in their path. Night returned to Narimasu with the same oppressive weight it had carried the evening before, but now the darkness seemed thicker, more absolute, as if the very sky above Japan understood that the hours ahead would bring no relief, only the repetition of a pattern that had already proven devastatingly effective, a pattern the Americans could sustain indefinitely, and Japan could barely survive once. The airfield lights were dimmed to slits, the mechanics worked beneath tarps to conceal activity, and the pilots waited in tense silence for the inevitable drone of engines that would signal the approach of another B-29 armada. Hiroshi sat inside the cockpit of his Ki-84, the canopy open and the cold night air stinging his cheeks, listening to the soft murmur of wind moving across the vast expanse of runway and trying to steady the rhythm of his breathing, because despite all his experience, despite the countless hours he had spent in combat, he knew that what awaited him in the sky was not a duel of equals, but an encounter with a machine whose calculations would begin the moment his aircraft appeared on its radar scope. The analog computers inside the bomber, already prepared to transform his presence into vectors, angles, and predictive firing solutions, before he could even see the formation against the darkness. As he waited for the order to scramble, he watched the senior flight officer move between aircraft, speaking quietly to each pilot, his face a mask of composure that did little to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. When the officer reached Hiroshi, he placed a gloved hand on the edge of the cockpit and spoke with a gravity that bypassed the formality of rank, reminding him that fuel was limited, that the Americans were expected to fly lower again, and that the priority was no longer to destroy bombers, but to disrupt their path. Anything that might slow their approach to Tokyo, anything that might throw off their incendiary patterns, anything that might buy even 10 minutes for the fire brigades, still struggling to contain the previous night's inferno. The officer's words carried the weight of a nation fighting not for victory but for time. Hiroshi nodded silently, acknowledging the grim reality that they were no longer interceptors in the traditional sense. They were obstacles, human wedges thrust into the gears of an enemy, machine that could operate around them with chilling efficiency. When the officer moved on, Hiroshi looked once more toward the city, the faint glow of lingering fires flickering behind a veil of smoke, and he wondered if there was any part of Tokyo left untouched. Any corner where families were not huddled in fear beneath wooden roofs that could ignite from a single M69 bomblet carried on the wind. A sudden crackle of radio static cut through the darkness, followed by the clipped voice of ground control, announcing the first radar contacts multiple bomber groups detected at long range, inbound from the southeast, altitude low and decreasing. And the airfield sprang into motion with a kind of practiced desperation. Mechanics pulling away chocks, pilots lowering goggles, engines screaming to life as the fighters taxied onto the runway one by one. Hiroshi felt the vibration of his Hayate's engine resonate through his spine, a familiar and almost comforting sensation. But beneath it lay the unmistakable knowledge that this machine, for all its power and grace, was outmatched by the fortress-like behemoths approaching from the sea. As Hiroshi accelerated down the dim runway and lifted into the night sky, the air immediately felt different, thicker, heavier, laden with smoke that reduced visibility and cast ghostly halos around his navigation lights. And he realized that even the atmosphere had turned against them, the rising heat from the ruined districts creating unstable pockets of turbulence that buffeted his aircraft as he climbed toward his assigned intercept altitude. Below him, the outline of Tokyo flickered like a burning constellation, and above him, in the dark void of the sky, lay the formation he knew was already beginning to calculate his path. Minutes later, when the first B-29 silhouettes appeared faintly against the stars, moving as a cohesive, unbroken chain across the horizon, Hiroshi felt the same mixture of awe and dread that had gripped him the previous night. The bombers seemed to glide with effortless confidence, their formation wide and loose, yet unmistakably coordinated, and he could almost imagine the quiet interior inside their pressurized cabins, the gunners seated comfortably at their sighting stations, the analog computers whirring softly as they interpreted the data fed to them through gyroscopic inputs and mirrored sight alignments. Hiroshi pushed his fighter forward, climbing rapidly to position himself for an angled approach, knowing that the moment he entered their engagement envelope, he would be exposed to the merciless logic of the fire control system. As he closed the distance, he felt the first flickers of tracer fire arc through the darkness, not random bursts, but precise streams, testing the air like the probing fingers of a machine searching for a target. And he realized with a sinking certainty that the computer had already marked him, already begun to compute his velocity, already predicted the path he would take in the next few seconds. He rolled hard to the left, diving beneath the formation in a maneuver designed to confuse manual gunners, but the tracers followed with uncanny cohesion, shifting in perfect alignment to match his movement, and he felt the unmistakable tremor of rounds striking the fuselage behind him. The system was not reacting to his dives and rolls. It was anticipating them, calculating the aerodynamic limits of his aircraft, projecting his next move the moment he initiated the first. Even as he forced his Hayate into a steep climb, trying desperately to break the computer's predictive lock, Hiroshi felt the aircraft shudder with another burst of impacts, and he knew that this was no longer a battle in any sense he had been trained to understand. It was a test of endurance against a machine that would continue to track him with mathematical indifference until he either broke away or ceased to exist altogether. And as he banked hard, diving once more toward the burning city below in an attempt to escape the relentless streams of fire cutting through the night sky, Hiroshi understood with chilling clarity that Japan's war in the air was no longer measured by sorties or dogfights, but by the widening gap between human instinct and mechanical precision. A gap that the B-29, with its cold analog brain and relentless fire control network, had widened beyond anything a pilot could hope to bridge. Hiroshi's dive carried him dangerously close to the rising heat of Tokyo's burning districts, the turbulence buffeting his Ki-84 as if invisible hands were striking the wings with uneven force. Yet, even in the midst of the violent downdrafts and chaotic air currents, he kept glancing over his shoulder toward the formation above, fully expecting the B-29's turrets to continue tracking him, with the same eerie synchrony that had nearly torn him apart moments earlier. And as he banked sharply to the west to regain altitude for another pass, he felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness settle over him, a choking realization that every maneuver he made existed inside calculations that had already been anticipated by a machine hundreds of meters above him. The city beneath him glowed like a fractured constellation, its streets transformed into glowing channels of fire, its neighborhoods reduced to smoldering grids, where the outlines of wooden houses flickered in and out of visibility through columns of black smoke. As Hiroshi climbed back toward the bomber stream, he felt the weight of the moment pressing into his consciousness. He was no longer flying to shoot down a bomber, no longer flying to protect strategic assets, no longer flying to defend a nation's infrastructure. He was flying simply because the alternative was to surrender the sky entirely. And that thought, more than the danger itself, sent a hollow ache through his chest. Above him, the B-29s continued their steady, unbroken advance, their formation moving with a majestic inevitability that seemed almost unnatural, each aircraft maintaining perfect spacing, despite the turbulence rising from the inferno below, and Hiroshi imagined the quiet hum of the analog fire control computers inside each bomber. The gyros feeding them precise measurements, the synchronous motors adjusting turret bearings in real time, the sighting stations working in perfect harmony as their operators, sealed inside the pressurized fuselage, calmly tracked the faint glimmer of fighters, attempting to climb into their deadly sphere of fire. He knew he had to try again, not because he believed the result would be any different, but because something deep within him refused to accept that a machine could dictate the outcome of a battle so completely, and so he leveled off at 7,000 feet, pushed the throttle to the edge of the red zone, and began a long, shallow climb that would place him at the same altitude as the trailing elements of the formation. It was a risky approach, one that exposed him early, but it was also his only chance to align a clean burst before the defensive turrets recalculated his position. As soon as he emerged from beneath a bank of smoke, the fire began again, not the scattered, frantic bursts of human gunners scrambling to adjust their aim, but the precisely aligned, mathematically perfect streams of tracer fire that rose from multiple angles and converged toward the exact patch of sky he was accelerating into. The tracers did not chase him. They intersected him, as if the computer guiding them had drawn invisible lines in the air and commanded the rounds to travel along them. Hiroshi rolled violently to the right, pulling every ounce of lift from his battered wings, and for a brief moment he slipped out of the predicted firing path. But the turrets adjusted as quickly as he moved, their barrels swinging with mechanical fluidity as they acquired new firing solutions in fractions of seconds. He felt the aircraft vibrate under a fresh wave of impacts, the tail now sluggish, the left aileron barely responsive, and he realized that another hit on the control surfaces would likely render the Ki-84 unflyable. Still, he pressed in. At 500 yards, he squeezed the trigger, sending a burst of 20 shells toward the nearest B-29, and he saw them strike the bomber's right wing root, sparks cascading into the night as fragments of metal tore free. But the damage, however real, was negligible compared to the torrent unleashed in response. 3 turrets, 2 dorsal, 1 ventral, swung into perfect alignment, their 50 caliber barrels blazing in a synchronized fury that lit the sky like a lattice of red lightning, and Hiroshi felt as though he were flying into the mouth of a mechanical beast whose jaws were closing around him. A round struck perilously close to his cockpit, shattering a gauge and sending shards of glass across the instrument panel. Another punched through the engine cowling, causing the Hayate to cough and sputter, its RPM needle dipping dangerously as fuel mixture and temperature fluctuated. Yet somehow, impossibly, he remained airborne, pushing past the bomber before flipping into a steep dive, letting gravity pull him away from the killing zone. The airflow howled around the canopy, the plane shaking in a way that suggested structural fatigue far worse than anything visible. And as Hiroshi struggled to stabilize the dive, he understood that the enemy he faced was not the bomber's crew, but the analog intelligence embedded within its defensive network, a system that had absorbed decades of American industrial innovation and transformed it into the deadliest defensive apparatus ever mounted on a wartime aircraft. He leveled off again at 3,000 feet, breathing hard, sweat stinging his eyes despite the cold air, and saw 2 more Hayats climbing from below. Young pilots, reckless and determined, their silhouettes stark against the burning city as they angled toward the bomber stream. He wanted to shout at them, warn them, tell them that the old tactics were already obsolete, but the radio crackled uselessly with overlapping transmissions, The chaos of a dozen pilots talking over one another as the fire control systems above them calculated each threat with chilling impartiality. And as Hiroshi watched the first of the young pilots roll into a head-on attack, only to be struck by a converging wall of tracers before he could fire a single shell, the Hayate disintegrating in a blossoming flash of white and orange, he felt a surge of despair so vast that it made the cockpit feel impossibly small, a coffin of aluminum hurtling through a sky now governed by machines. In that moment, he understood why the Americans were winning, why every interception ended the same way, why no amount of bravery or training or sacrifice could alter the outcome. Because the battlefield had moved beyond human limits, and Japan had nothing left that could reach across that widening gulf. As Hiroshi finally broke away from the bomber stream, his Ki-84 groaning under the strain of torn control surfaces and overheating engine cylinders, he felt a numbness spreading through him. Not fear, not adrenaline, but the hollow, heavy certainty of a man who has seen the future and knows with unshakable clarity that he does not belong to it. Because above him, gliding with serene indifference across the night sky, the B-29s continued their advance, as if untouched by the desperate efforts of the interceptors below, their turret systems scanning the darkness with the calm precision of machines that never tired, never hesitated, never misjudged. His dive toward Narimasu was steep and uneven, the aircraft shuddering violently each time he adjusted the rudder, and for a moment he believed he might not make it back. But the faint outline of the airfield appeared through the smoke-filled haze, and he coaxed the dying Hayate downward, knowing that even if he landed safely, even if the mechanics could salvage what remained of his machine, the outcome of the war in the air had already been written in the cold mathematics of the enemy's fire control networks. As the wheels touched down and skidded across the runway's rough surface, he felt the fuselage tremble beneath him like a wounded animal collapsing at last. And when the aircraft finally rolled to a stop, its engine coughing one final breath before falling silent, Hiroshi opened the canopy and was greeted not by relief, but by the same distant glow of Tokyo's burning districts that had greeted him the night before, a glow that seemed now not like a fire but like a verdict. He climbed down slowly, boots hitting the tarmac, and the moment he turned toward the city, he realized that every man on the airfield had stopped what he was doing to watch the horizon, their silhouettes dark against the fading embers, their faces lit by the orange reflections of a capital half in ruins. And in their silence he sensed the collective understanding that no valor, no tactic, no last-minute innovation could turn back what the night sky had revealed, that the Americans had built a bomber so advanced, so thoroughly integrated, so far removed from the capabilities of the Japanese industry, that challenging it had become less an act of warfare and more an act of sacrifice. When the squadron commander approached him, the man looked older, decades older, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of decisions he could no longer justify. And though he spoke softly, almost gently, the meaning struck like a blow. Command wanted reports, detailed accounts of the engagement, every observation Hiroshi could provide about the turret behavior, the predictive firing, the synchronization between stations. Yet even as the words left the officer's mouth, both men understood that no amount of analysis would change the reality that Japan lacked the time, the fuel, the steel, the engineers, and the industrial depth to counter a weapon that represented the pinnacle of another nation's technological evolution. Later, in the dimly lit briefing room, Hiroshi wrote the truth in long, steady strokes. The B-29's defense is controlled by an analog computer. The turrets coordinate automatically. The accuracy is beyond human. Conventional tactics cannot succeed. And as he laid the pencil down, he felt a hollow ache move through him, because he knew that these words, though honest and precise, would do nothing but document the collapse already unfolding. When he finally stepped outside again, the fires in Tokyo had dimmed to a dull red glow, the smoke rising in slow, heavy columns toward the first pale hints of morning. And Hiroshi looked toward the sky, the same sky he had flown in since his youth, the sky he had once believed belonged to pilots with courage, instinct, and skill, and realized that this belief had been swept away by a machine whose mind was made not of nerves and fear, but of gears, relays, and synchronized motors. He stood there for a long time, the cold air biting at his face, until the squadron commander walked quietly to stand beside him, and for a moment the two men watched the sky in silence, the horizon smoldering like a dying forge. Eventually the commander spoke, his voice quiet but steady, acknowledging what neither had dared to say aloud. This war will not be decided by men anymore, only by machines and the nations that can build them. And Hiroshi nodded, because he had seen the truth of it with his own eyes, felt it in the vibrating metal of his wounded aircraft, heard it in the synchronized roar of the bomber formation above Tokyo. An entire philosophy of warfare taking shape in the cold hum of analog computers that turned every Japanese fighter into a predictable variable. As he walked away from the runway and toward the barracks where sleep would not come, Hiroshi understood, at last, the full meaning of what he had witnessed. The B-29 was not merely a bomber, it was a declaration, a technological dividing line blazing across the night sky, marking the end of one age of warfare and the beginning of another. And for pilots like him, fighting with machines built for a world that no longer existed, that line had arrived too late to cross. And so, beneath a sky still glowing with the memory of fire, Lieutenant Nakamura Hiroshi accepted the truth that had been written in tracer fire above Tokyo. The war in the air had already been lost, not by failure of courage, but by the unstoppable logic of a machine. Japan could never match.